Good evening, everybody. We're pleased to have you here. I just wanted to ask everybody to take their seats, please, because we're going to get started. And I'll be talking to you in a minute, but the first thing we're going to see is a video from our Congressman, Jared Huffman, welcoming you to this event.
Good evening. I'm Congressman Jared Huffman, and thank you for allowing me to join tonight's program by way of this video message. I also want to thank the program sponsors, Organizing for Action Marin in partnership with FIREsafe Marin, Marin County Fire Department, San Rafael Fire Department, Drawdown Marin, the Marin Conservation League, 350 Marin, Cool Effects, Marin Interfaith Climate Action, Sustainable San Rafael, Resilient Neighborhoods, Sustainable Marin, and Sierra Club Marin Group. There's no shortage of great groups working on this very important issue, and that is a good thing. You know, Benjamin Franklin is famous for a lot of things, but I mention him today for two reasons. He founded the first all-volunteer fire company in the colonies, and he had some pretty good ideas about fire policy, starting with, quote, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, end quote. We all know that one. We've been lucky in Marin relative to some of our North Bay neighbors, and it's crucial to be ready for what could very well come our way soon. An ounce of prevention doesn't mean you're cured forever, because no matter what we do to prevent a fire, there isn't a foolproof cure. So, there have been many historic wildfires in recent years. We know about that. Each one seems to eclipse the one before in magnitude of damage and the geography covered. Unfortunately, I've seen firsthand, and I've breathed the smoke. This new all-year-round fire cycle in California is a real thing, and it's good that you're having an event like this to give it the attention it deserves. Given the climate crisis we're facing, conditions are going to get worse, and we should be ready for extreme weather to lead to more frequent and more intense disasters. Marin is chipping away at developing a comprehensive community response to preparedness. I want to underscore the importance of that word, comprehensive, because a local, coordinated, and comprehensive approach to fire prevention and disaster readiness needs to be just that. You've got a great set of knowledge and skilled panelists lined up tonight to help you with the community planning. And I look forward to following along the good work that you do, supporting it as both a resident of Marin County and as your representative in Congress. There's a lot of work for us to do, and tonight won't finish that job. But thank you in advance for your commitment and endurance, and please know that I'm here to help. I hope you have a productive evening.
Welcome. And it's very uplifting to follow Congressman Huffman. He always understands what we're doing and says it so well. 2 years ago, in the same place, November 2017, we had our first Firestorm event. Okay, following the 2017 destructive wildfires, where we also renewed our commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement. This year, our event, Firestorm, Wildfires and Climate, comes at a time when both crises have worsened. California experienced the deadliest wildfires in its history in 2017 and 18, and worries exist now for 2019, I understand. And the latest UN report, the IPCC report, gives us just 12 years to make massive and unprecedented changes to global energy infrastructure to limit global warming. Climate change has created a new wildfire reality. One question as we engage in comprehensive efforts to reduce wildfire risk, what steps can we take to reduce climate risks as well? Assure reduction of carbon emissions, transition to clean energy, and protect our natural environment. Marin County and the city of San Rafael have been busy. You will learn in some detail from our panelists the facts, and they are dizzying, and see what is happening and decide how you want to be involved. Any questions about these looming threats from experts in climate, insurance, Public Health and Rebuilding will be there to answer your questions. Okay, Organizing for Action has taken the lead in organizing tonight's event. I want to thank those with OFA and other partner groups who made this all possible. Meg McCabe, please stand up, yes, whose insights, talents, persistence are unparalleled. We visited Paradise together in April and made a video. It changed our lives. I want to thank, too, the San Rafael Fire Department and FIREsafe Marin. We thank them. We want to thank Quinn Gardner. Are you there, Quinn? You can, and Marshall now for their support and cooperation. We thank, too, Todd Lando from FIREsafe Marin, Nancy Benjamin from Marin Conservation League, and Bill Carney from Sustainable San Rafael. And then our OFA volunteers who helped make this all possible. Why don't you all stand? Sylvia Russell, Ed Lai, Victoria Holdridge, Dolores Heeb, and our interns, our Drake High School interns, and others who have been here tonight. And then I want to also thank and acknowledge the partner groups, and you'll see them on the back of the program. And unfortunately, one was left out, which is the Environmental Forum of Marin, which has been a sincere partner from the beginning. But next time we have this, we'll make sure they're in there. They bring detailed and relevant information, and the tables on all sides, and you've probably visited them, and learn what you can. And the partners have been mentioned by Jared and his, so I don't need to repeat them. But I also want to acknowledge these CMCM for taping this performance, this program, and the Freedom Singers for their wonderful entertainment and songs. And we have a few public officials. We have Katie Rice is here. Would you want to stand? There you are, yeah. She put on a wonderful, wonderful program earlier. And anybody else who is an elected official? I can't tell. Okay, good, fine. All right, so that's that. And finally, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. Your participation is crucial for any of these initiatives to be successful. So let me just tell you what's going to happen tonight. The first thing is that I'm going to introduce to you Peter B. Collins, who is going to moderate this panel tonight. And Peter is a veteran Bay Area radio host with a daily podcast at his peterbcollins.com and a weekly TV interview show on Marin's Comcast Channel 26, Wednesdays at 8 p.m. So we're very delighted to have Peter help us pull together all the various threads that are happening. So I'm introducing him, and then the speakers will each speak and present their slides, and they'll come up here and do that. And then each one will, when it is finished, we will move the screen, and we have a table for the panel to sit, and they will sit there, and they will talk among themselves, and then there will be questions from the audience. And I wanted to mention this. You have cards on your chairs. Please pick them up and jot down questions that you have, and we will have people going up and down the aisles collecting your questions, because we really want to hear from you. Thank you very much. Let's get started.
Thank you, Belle. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here this evening to try to reduce the risk to Marin County of the kind of wildfires that we've seen too much of in recent years. It was only 6 months ago today that the campfire started in the morning, and by the evening, Paradise was destroyed. 85 people were killed. Thousands of people lost their homes. And my schedule is pretty fixed. I record a podcast every day between 2 and 2:30. Then I take a break and I take my dog for a walk. And when I went outside at 3 o'clock on that day, I was shocked. I had heard there was a fire in Butte County, but I didn't expect our air to be hazy so quickly. And the particulates that we could see, that fine film on your car or on the sidewalk. And I have pretty good health and respiration, but I was wheezing and coughing, and people who have more serious issues had to stay indoors. Many people were wearing surgical masks or even better quality masks to filter their breathing. And I don't know about you, but I went home and packed the important things. And I looked around and recognized some things that I could have done and should have done on our own property based on what we learned in 2017. And our neighborhood now has a FIREsafe committee. We had a cleanup day in March, and I feel like I've been working ever since. Many loads to the dump, filling up all those yard waste cans. And so I think we all have to look at what we can do as individuals in our personal property and our own neighborhoods. We have to look at what we can do as a community. And we have to look at what is needed to address both reducing our fuel, and Lordy, Marin County's got fuel. And then we also need to be prepared if a firestorm does reach our areas. We've got a lot of narrow roads, difficult evacuations. And the more prepared we are, the more we have thought it out, the better our odds are of surviving. So thank you for being here. We have an impressive group of people who will give short talks, shorter than a TED Talk, I've been promised. And if they go too long, we have a timekeeper here, and we'll call the Sergeant at Arms and have to heave him off the stage. Before I introduce our first speaker, I do want to add that Renee Goddard is here, Fairfax Town Council member. Jack Gibson, board member of MMWD. We got water. And from the Las Galinas Valley Sanitary District Board, Crystal Yesman. Crystal, thanks for being here. Professor Leroy Westerling is our first speaker. Professor of Management of Complex Systems, Director of the Center for Climate Communications at UC Merced. His research interests and publications are in applied climatology, climate ecosystem, wildfire interactions, statistical modeling for seasonal forecasts, paleofire reconstructions, and maybe he can explain that for novices, climate change impact assessments, and resource management and policy. He's a graduate of UCLA and got his PhD at UC San Diego. Please welcome Leroy Westerling.
All right, well, it's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me all right, or do I need to hold this? Hold it. It's going to cramp my style. All right, here we go. Next, please. So wildfire has been increasing steadily around the western United States. And when we first started looking at this quantitatively and rigorously, we were looking at federal forest fire data, because our mountain forests are some of the most sensitive ecosystems responding to temperature much more rapidly than fires at lower elevations did. And here what I'm showing is the number of large fires, the area burned in large fires in forests around the western US. And the height of each bar is showing the total area burned in that year. And then those horizontal lines are showing the decadal averages. So you can see that decade by decade, our forest fires have been increasing. And you'll also notice that there's a lot of variability from year to year, and that's really typical of this kind of a process. But that big green line there, so if it's green, it was burning in the northern and central Rockies. So think like from the Canadian border down to Yellowstone. And that area of the western US, those forests have accounted for about 2/3 or a little less of the increase in forest fires. And it's primarily been in lightning-ignited fires, not human-ignited fires. But that big spike there back in 1988, those are those iconic Yellowstone fires in '88. And people thought of that sort of as a natural event. But in recent decades, we've had a lot of big fire years like that, even though you would only expect that to happen every 100, 150 years on average in the Rockies. Next, please. Well, it turns out that that increase in the number of large forest fires around the western US is highly correlated with temperature. And it's correlated with temperature for a variety of reasons. One is that warmer temperatures give you earlier snowmelt at higher elevations, but all across the elevation gradient from down here by sea level all the way up, you see more evaporation. The warmer it gets, the more water the atmosphere can hold. And as the atmosphere draws more water out of the fuels, they become more flammable. Next slide, please. But another thing is going on besides just increases in temperature that's driven by climate change, and that is increasing variability of precipitation. So we live in a region that has highly variable precipitation to begin with. In California, it's a relative handful of storms each year that account for most of the precipitation that we get. So if you lose a couple of storms, that's the difference between an average year and a really dry year. Conversely, if you gain a couple, it could be a really wet year. And as you warm up the planet, you tend to warm the high latitudes, so think like the Arctic, Canada, and Alaska, faster than the equator. Because there's more processes at higher latitudes that provide positive feedbacks that enhance the warming, like melting snow, right? Melting ice. And as you warm up the poles faster than the equator, you reduce the temperature differential between the equator and the higher latitudes. And that temperature difference is what drives the winds and the atmospheric circulation. So we get a slower and loopier sort of jet stream with big peaks and troughs in it. And you get these weather patterns that set up and they persist much longer and they move much more slowly. So you can get a lot of rain or a very dry period compared to what was the historical norm. So on top of this warming trend that evaporates a lot more of our moisture and melts our snow out earlier, we have this increasing variability in our precipitation. And that's been very important for these fires that we've had in 2017 and 2018 late in the year. So the Camp Fire that took out Paradise started in November, right? The Thomas Fire in Ventura in 2017 is the first mega fire starting in December. And in both cases, there hadn't been any real significant precipitation in the fall that would have shut down the fire season by wetting all those fuels. Next. So if we look at the trend in drought, decade by decade around the western US, so here the darker red it is, the more of a trend there was towards drier conditions over that decade. And the more blue it is, the wetter it got over that course of that decade. So the first decade we're looking at, mid-70s to mid-80s, there's no significant trend. It's just sort of statistical noise. The second decade, there's that real strong dry, wet pattern. You tend to see that when you have a really strong El Nino, La Nina sequence, for example. And that kind of short-term variability would really drown out a long-term trend. But then the last two decades here on the bottom, what you're seeing is increasing trends towards more intense aridity over a greater and greater area. Next slide, please. And this is what was predicted long before by climate models. So this is published in 2010, but based on work over the preceding decade. And it's showing the drying, so the darker red it is, the more drying there is projected across all the different climate models for the decade 2000 to 2009, and you'll see the interior western United States and other continental interiors drying out in this map. Next slide, please. And that is something that's predicted to continue to intensify over the coming decades. So this drying trend in the background is what's driving all of these problems we've been having with fire and with like beetle kill, for example, and the dieback in our forests that interact with fire. And it's not something that's going to end anytime soon. And basically what we're doing is we're changing the climate, and so we're changing the kind of ecosystem that we can have on our landscape and the kind of services that it can provide to us. And the way it changes is not gradually, but in steps. Wildfires, beetles, big droughts, wipe out what's there and reset the landscape so it looks progressively more and more like what is suitable to the climate that we're giving it. Next slide, please. So it's not just the area is increasing, it's that the size of the largest fires increases over time. And here I'm showing on the right in the solid bars the largest fire each year from the satellite-based record for California. And on the left, the 3 largest fires that we know about in the documentary record before that satellite record began. And so it's possible every now and then, even without a really strong climate change signal in that first half of the graph, to get a big fire year. But in recent decades, we're getting fires that are much larger than those and with much greater and greater frequency. And this includes fires, so the ones with little stars, those are like wind-driven fires in the fall, typically. And some of the others are more like plume-driven fires that aren't driven by wind, but create their own circulation with the heat of the fire. And so it's not one type of fire. This is fires from down by the coast in Chaparral to the Rim Fire, which is the largest fire we know of in the history of the Sierra Nevada forest, not just from the documentary record or the satellite record, but from reconstructions of what fire was like before European settlement. Next slide, please. And so now we do a lot of modeling to try and understand how these relationships that we see between climate and fuels and fire in recent decades might evolve in the near term to long term as we alter the climate or we alter our development patterns on the landscape. And here what I'm showing you is the changes in particulate matter emitted by fires in the Sierra Nevada under different scenarios. So in the upper left panel, it's what it would look like with a historic climate without any fuels treatment. And in the upper right, it's what it would look like around mid-century if you didn't treat any fuels. You see there's a big increase in the particulate pollution. Why is this important for people in Marin? Because you're not directly impacted usually by a fire burning in the Sierras unless you go up there. But the pollution from those fires affects millions more people than are directly interacting with that fire. Well, it turns out that if you treat just 15% of the forest area that's assessed as being capable of being treated, and by treated I mean you go and you thin the fuels mechanically, and then you burn like prescribed fires or management fires in the fall and the spring, you get a big reduction in how much air pollution you'd see from those fires in the lower left. And in the right, if you did 30% of the administrative areas, which is about 100% of what you could do in a lot of cases, you would actually have less pollution from those fires after quite a bit of climate change over the next several decades than we did in the historic period. So there's a lot that we can do in California to reduce the impact of climate change and climate change-driven fires on the population. The next slide, please. So I've been the lead author on the fire part of the climate assessments for the state of California. We've had 4 of them now over the last 15 years. And we provide these products that are simulations of what fires would look like in the future under different scenarios for fuels management, population growth, development footprint, and climate. And I just showing you here an example from the 4th assessment that just finished. So on the left are 2 different scenarios. They're the same exact climate scenario for the same exact month right? And those dots are simulated individual large fires that we can use for scenario analysis, for people planning around to understand their vulnerability to climate change. And when we aggregate thousands of those, we get an average map like this on the right, what fire might look like. If you go to the next slide, you can see on the upper left is what the historic conditions looked like, and these other three images are what fire in California might look like by the end of the century under three different climate scenarios with sort of middle-of-the-road population growth and things like that. So there's some variation, but you see like the biggest increases are really in the forested areas of the state. Now, the next slide. But we're not just simulating over the forested areas of the state, we're simulating over places like Marin County, too. So I'm just showing you an example of three mega fires that were simulated for this assessment over Marin. So, and they're all from a climate, one particular climate scenario, but it's not that different from any of the others. And I just picked out three, so one in 1998, one in 2023, and one in 2082. And the biggest one is actually, the one that affects the county the most is actually the earliest. So the model is indicating that there's a small risk, but there is a risk even in the historic conditions for very significant fires in Marin County, just as some of our introducers mentioned. So currently I'm working with the county of San Mateo, for example, helping them and their first responders and fire chiefs and things like that develop planning scenarios around this kind of information to understand what transport networks and infrastructure and stuff like that could be affected by different large fire scenarios. And this is something that we'll be continuing to develop at much finer spatial scales over the next 5 years for the whole state as part of the fifth climate assessment for California. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Christie Neill. She started her career back in the 1980s as a wildland firefighter for the U.S. Forest Service, worked her way up through the ranks, became a Forest Division chief, and then she moved to the regional office as Regional Fuels and Fire Use Specialist, then worked for the National Park Service for 10 years. She came to Marin County in 2014 as Vegetation Management Program Battalion Chief. She's responsible for coordination and implementation of oversight of the Green Waste and Defensible Space Inspection Program, updating community wildfire protection and county-wide fire plans, identification of vegetation management projects, and needed environment compliance process. She's a liaison to FIREsafe Marin and FireWise Community Development and Support. Please welcome Christie Neill.
Hear me okay? All right, thanks. So living with fire, obviously our new reality, right? So next slide. Certainly in the last 4 years, California has experienced the 10 most destructive wildfires, 4 of those being the deadliest in California's history. 2018, fires burned more than 1.8 million acres in California and destroyed 22,000 structures and tragically claimed 100 lives. Obviously, our problem is climate change. It's created our new wildfire reality in California especially. Wildfires are bigger, burning longer, causing more damage, killing more people than ever before. Homes are built in fire-prone areas, increasing our risk and our cost. Fire seasons are longer, on average almost 84 days longer than it was in the 1970s. And in California, it's like we have a year-round fire season. I know going to incidents since the 90s, being on incident management teams, that we'd only usually be out 5-10 days maybe, but today, the last several years, it's like 14 days, 21 days, and it's a continual cycle. Come home for a couple days, you're out again, so it's nonstop. More communities are impacted by fire, insurance losses are rising, cost of suppression is rising. California alone last year exceeded $12 billion in suppression costs. Danger's increasing, and the average firefighter fatalities rose from 9 per year to 19 per year. So next slide, please. I'm not sure if folks realize, but a lot of the federal budget goes to the firefighting costs, not necessarily the local governments that are making some of these land use decisions. Next slide. The trend is obviously the problem's likely getting worse in the future. Warmer climate as discussed, denser forests and vegetation, more human ignitions, more homes in the way, creating a bigger wildfire problem, and more frequent and catastrophic fires. As Professor Westerling discussed, the frequency of fires is tied to that early snowmelt. Fire seasons are starting earlier, the season's going longer. Denser vegetation and forests contributing to extreme fire behavior. So this makes fire response difficult and dangerous for everyone. A lot more human-caused fires. 84% of the fires are started by humans. And again, more homes in the way. Next slide. So what's Marin County Fire Department doing? And a lot of what I'll talk about is what all the departments are doing here in Marin County. Our new reality for wildfires, some of the things that we're doing is increasing our defensible space inspection programs. A lot of departments have 1 or 2 dedicated people, maybe a part-time staff, but we're trying to increase that. We just hired 10 seasonal inspectors that started this week in Marin County Fire and Ross Valley Fire, so we'll start doing more inspections. We've added on to some of our fire crews for increased response and fuel reduction work with our partners. We're working to improve our evacuation procedures with law enforcement and OES. We're increasing our pre-positioning of fire crews and equipment during especially extreme weather events, and there are funds now through the state OES to help with that. We're building off our lessons learned each year, and many of us respond to fires throughout the California and throughout the western United States, so we're bringing back lots of lessons learned, especially how it relates to our operational strategies to protect values at risk. We're putting a lot more emphasis on unified command and engaging our stakeholders stand side by side with us when we're managing these incidents, those with jurisdictional responsibilities. The Board of Supervisors sponsored a subcommittee on lessons learned, and we're also bringing some of those operational experiences from our own responders. Next slide, please. So we were asked to address some of the questions. So how does the fire department tamp down climate change and fires? I'm not sure that the fire department can do it all by themselves. Certainly we can all be more environmentally responsible locally. We're trying to be more strategic in our staffing. Our pre-positioning, community preparedness is huge. I think we're challenged with a lot of environmental and air quality rules and regulations, and public tolerance from smoke if we were to increase our prescriptive controlled burning, and that versus wildfire smoke, which is worse. We were hugely impacted the last couple of fire seasons from the smoke coming from the North Bay fires in 2017 to the Camp Fire, all the smoke that came into Marin County last year. What's worse, burning now under controlled conditions or when it burns under extreme conditions? So what's working? What are some of the obstacles? Certainly we've made improvements to interagency communications, cooperation and coordination with our partners, law enforcement and OES. I think the public is finally starting to hear what we've been saying, which is refreshing, and they're starting to take action, which is great, but more's needed. We have lots of challenges. I think there's tons of information out there. Do we have the ability to sort through all that and absorb what's important? And then monitoring our progress, certainly through compliance for simple things like defensible space, other preparedness actions, monitoring progress of levels of community action, drills, education, those kinds of things. And then certainly we can track our overall progress with getting people, registered for Alert Marin, which is our primary emergency notification system in Marin County. Next slide. Public outreach is critical. A couple items that we've done a lot of public outreach on would be, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of these, is the CWPP in 2016 Community Wildfire Preparedness Plan. Our lessons learned, sponsored by the Board of Supervisors. FIREsafe Marin is doing a ton, living with fire. Us and the fire departments are all working together to have consistent messaging. Tons of community action, lots of groups out there, more to do, Ready, Set, Go, CERT, Ready, Get Ready, Marin, Firewise. Everyone needs to take responsibility, it's really important. Next slide. So a little bit about our 2016 Community Wildfire Protection Plan. Basically, next slide, it was a science-based effort that included fire behavior modeling across the county to help us prioritize where we do work and what would be beneficial for reducing and changing fire behavior. Next slide. That's a slide that basically highlights very high flame lengths with high rates of spread overlaid with population density. So that helped us prioritize where our work could be done. Next slide. Some of the CWPP recommendations include ongoing efforts to continue to identify and evaluate our fire hazards in Marin, continue to promote land use planning related to fire risk and hazard, collaborate on our development and implementation of wildland fire protection plans, integrate fire and fuel management practices, increase awareness, and actions that individuals and communities can take to reduce loss and property damage from wildland fires. Next slide. The CWPP helps us guide our programs in all the fire departments in Marin, whether it's fire prevention, county code, fire and ordinances, fuels and vegetation management work, community defense, a variety of things. So we use that document to help guide our work collaboratively. Next slide, please. So some of the other highlights that we've been involved with, obviously the Lessons Learned North Bay Fire Siege report sponsored by the Board of Supervisors. Next slide. The background on that was basically a subcommittee of fire, law, and emergency and land managers came together and we analyzed three primary areas: wildland fire preparedness, prevention and protection, vegetation management, emergency notifications, and evacuations. Some of the recommendations that came out of that had to do with codes. Our Marin County Fire Prevention Officers have been tasked to review all the countywide codes and recommendations and have some proposals for amendments for this year, which is a code adoption year. So that's in the works. Vegetation management plan updates for new construction and remodels. There's recommendations to update some of the building codes. You know, maybe 7A should be applied to all the areas versus just WUI. We need to streamline and increase our enforcement and compliance processes with defensible space, increase our compliance with enforcement and planning related to parking, certainly potential recommendations to ban and prohibit pyrophytic plantings in our 2020 ordinance and standards. Next slide. Additionally, in planning and mapping, there's new work that can be done to update our community wildfire protection plan based on some new high-resolution vegetation modeling. Potential parcel level fire threat assessment. We have some funds dedicated to help with that. Obviously, we're looking at primary and secondary evacuation routes throughout the county, working with DPW, with PG&E, expanding some of our vegetation removal projects through grants. The county submitted 7 grants to the last CAL FIRE fire prevention grant process, and we were actually, FIREsafe Marin was awarded one very large grant to deal with evacuation routes. Next slide. Some of the recommendations, community outreach, education alerts and warnings. Several of the fire departments work together to standardize all the messaging for our red flag warnings and alerts that we have several times a year, typically in the late summer. FIREsafe Marin is going to mail out this really beautiful Living with Fire magazine that you'll all see at the end of the month. Marin's become #1 in terms of FireWise communities, and I know Todd will talk about that. We've got over 40 sites in Marin. Spanish translation has been completed for Alert Marin for that notification system. And there's a lot of efforts working on adding redundancy to our notification system in Marin for evacuations. Next slide. Under preparedness, again, we're working to pre-position resources during critical weather events. That'll be ongoing. We are collaborating with our partners and PG&E on vegetation management programs. MMWD currently, our crews are out burning today with the water district, expanding fuel reduction work. And certainly, we've expanded work with our largest landowners, Parks and Open Space and the National Park Service and the Water District, and working together on fire hazard reduction projects through utilizing our fire crews. Next slide. The Chiefs Association are addressing fire protection issues and preparedness needs consistently across the county. We have great support from our electeds. Last weekend, the Marin County Fire Chiefs and groups rolled out some fire mitigation initiatives for a county-wide initiative focused on fuel reduction, increasing fire crews and fuels crews, addressing structural ignitability, defensible space, building codes, public education, evacuation routes, public alerts and notifications. Next slide. So wrapping up, we've been busy, all the departments have in fire in Marin County. Specifically, our priorities as a department right now is preparing for the 2019 fire season. I'm not sure what that's going to look like, but we're anticipating the worst. So we've hired our seasonals, they'll start their training. We are in a shared services agreement with Ross Valley Fire, so we're one big department now working together. We also have an agreement with the National Park Service, so we're the fire department for Point Reyes National Seashore, Golden Gate National Recreation Area, working closely with our partners with the Water District. A lot of work being done with community preparedness and education, working closely with FIREsafe Marin. We're all doing Living with Fire sessions so that we can help people understand what they need to do to improve their survivability from wildfires. Park Service and County Parks and Open Space have funded 2 of our fire crews to do fuel reduction work on their lands. And we're doing a lot of work with the Chiefs Association on lessons learned items. Certainly, I talked about a code adoption year, so there's lots of work there. And a big item working in partnership with our Department of Public Works folks on evacuation route, vegetation clearance, and we need a lot of help from the community to do that, and obviously lots of grants. Next slide, I'm not going to talk about FIREsafe Marin because they're here to talk for themselves, and a great partner with lots of work on fire education and preparedness. That's it, thank you.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce Joel Laucher, a senior advisor at the California Department of Insurance. And he has survived 34 years at the department with colorful commissioners ranging from Steve Poizner to my buddy John Garamendi, Dave Jones, and even Chuck Quackenbush. So he's a survivor. He's worked in almost every department at the Department of Insurance and served as Chief Deputy Commissioner. Before joining the department, he worked as a commercial lines insurance underwriter. And before that, he grabbed a BA in literature at UC Santa Cruz. And he still prefers to read fiction over insurance policies. Please welcome Joel Laucher.
Before I go to the stage, I just want to walk through. My insurance company sent me this form, and it talks a little about coverage and underinsurance. And I was wondering if any of you have seen a form like this from your insurance companies. Does it look familiar? Does this form look familiar? People's got a box that tells what coverage you have. Yeah, most people. So, I wrote this form.
It's very fine literature, I'm sure.
It is fine literature. Thank you, Peter. This form goes out every other year in every homeowner's policy in California, which makes me one of the most published authors of all time and also the least read author of all time. So good for me. Thank you. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I'm going to throw some statistics at you as well. The first one is just another look at how destructive the fires have been in recent years. Here showing the 15 most destructive fires in California history and highlighting that 9 of those 15 happened since September of 2015. So all within these last few years. As you know, we talk about insurance. I'd like you to kind of think of it from insurers' perspective a little bit too. And this is the world they're seeing. So next slide. So this is insurance loss information for the last 2 years. In 2017, you see that insurers lost over $12 billion paid on wildfires. The next year, 2018, even more, $13.1 billion paid out. So huge years. What does that equate to in terms of the experience for insurers? Next slide, please. So in 2017, the loss ratio for homeowners insurers was 201%. That means for every dollar of premium that State Farm and Allstate and all those companies took in, they paid out $2. And that's not a profit-making way to do business, right? And you may know this, but insurers are about profit. Little better year for homeowners insurers in 2018, 170%. Still, that would have been far and away the record year had it not been for 2017. Only in 1991, where there was maybe around 118% loss ratio, did anything even approach these numbers. And 1991 was, at that time, the largest fire. Anybody know what fire that is? Oakland Hills. Right, so those were the losses insurers absorbed. This is the result that they feel then, these levels of loss ratio. Typically, an insurer's loss ratio hovers around 50% each year. So next slide, please. So for the people that have suffered these losses, Woolsey Fire, Hill Fire, Carr Fire, Camp Fire, what is it that they go through? So number one is underinsurance. And I don't know if I mentioned to you, there's a form that goes out to you every 2 years. And on that form, it says, don't be underinsured. So I'll ask you right here, how many of you are homeowners? And how many of you have insurance? Good for you. Every hand that said homeowners should also raise for insurance, I hope. And how did that limit for your dwelling come to be the number it is today? Where's that number for your dwelling? Right, your limit of liability that they're going to pay you if your house were to burn down? For most people, that's a number that they maybe selected when they first went to their insurer 15 years ago, and it's renewed every year from whatever that number started from, and the company incrementally has increased it, maybe due to inflation or whatever they do each year, and it is where it is, and you've never really tested whether that number would actually be enough to rebuild your home. And that's not just true of you, that is true of almost everybody in this country. People don't really like to talk about insurance much, so when you get your homeowner's bill, most people pay the premium, don't look any further, and put that away. So one of the things I'm suggesting to you, and will re-suggest at the end of this presentation, is to make sure you're not underinsured. So the other issues that happen after a big fire, demand surge, right? Isolated locations, not a lot of labor available to rebuild homes. So labor's tough, you gotta pay a lot. There aren't even that many contractors around. Some of these places like the Carr Fire up in the far northern California, or the Camp Fire out in Paradise, you know, there isn't a surplus of labor there or contractors. There's just enough to do their daily work that there might be on a routine day. Now, all of a sudden, you have 9,000 homes to rebuild. So how's that going to happen? It's only going to happen if you pay exorbitant prices to get it rebuilt. Inventory of personal property is another thing that claimants complain about the most. And just to give you a quick little primer on insurance on how contents recovery works, you give your, if you had a damage to your home, even not a total loss, and you lost some of your contents, you'd have to list every single item that burned, and you'd have to list when you bought it and what condition it's in, how much you paid for, every item. So, you know, your crock pot, your lawnmower, your 3 ties and your 12 shirts and your everything that's in that kitchen drawer, your junk drawer with the scissors you use to cut the dog's hair, all of that, if you want to replace it, you'd have to list it. The company would give you the actual cash value for that. Hey, pair of socks, you bought it for $5. We'll give you $1 because they're used. When you buy new socks, let me, the insurer, know. I'll give you the other $4. It is a grueling experience. So it's better if you are prepared and have a general idea of the inventory of your home, which you can do by filming it with your phone, just to have some record of it if you don't want to go through the process of writing it all down. At least give yourself some hints as to what you had if you had a loss. That is a really tough time for people in wildfire areas because they're just not renting a place a mile away while they rebuild. People from Paradise are having to move all over the state to find housing, right? There was no housing available, much housing in Chico. So it's a big problem for folks. Time limitations on coverages, that means you have a certain amount of time to get the building process going and rebuild. And that's tough again when there aren't a lot of contractors. So these are the common issues that come up. And of course, when your town burns down, it is tough for everyone. They don't know if they want to go back. The schools are down, all their neighbors are gone, everybody's moved away. It is a whole new thing. And the new issue that has arisen everywhere in this state is, am I going to be non-renewed? Or am I going to keep my coverage? Or is my coverage, my insurance coverage for homeowners, going to be so expensive I can't afford it? So next slide, please. So this is the kind of information that fire departments generally share. They're about defensible space, right? Trying to clear that area around your home. It's critical that you do that. Do what you control, right? The things that you can do around your home to make it safe. Next slide. And in days past, years past, insurers would have accepted that what you control as how they would decide whether to write coverage for you or not. But that's no longer true because now insurers generally use a fire risk model that evaluates each and every home through satellite imagery in the entire state, and actually these are countrywide tools. They assign a wildfire score to that home based on the fuel, the access, and the slope of the home. So in this picture, this is not far from here. We're down there at the bottom, the community center. Here's a circle with some homes are kind of in the middle of that circle. It's near the Museum of Propaganda, which I assume is bursting at the seams lately. But so that circle around, there's a home there in the middle with like a white roof you can see in the middle of that circle. So an insurance company is going to take into account, at the very least, this circumference around the home. And if it's an area with high winds or other issues, canyons cutting through it, they'll take into account an even broader area going out for miles around that home in making their decision whether to write it, because the tool that they use, the modeling tool that assigns a score, is taking into account that bigger picture. So FireWise community is a great thing because you really need all of your neighbors to be engaged in this too. Because if they're not, you can't do enough at your own property to make sure you're going to be able to keep your coverage. Next slide, please. So, people are asking, well, why can my insurer non-renew me? I've been with them 20 years. I've never had a loss. I always paid my premium on time. There are very few rules that govern how much leeway an insurer has in determining its underwriting decisions. Underwriting are the rules that insurers use to decide what kind of house they're willing to write. Older home, wood shake shingles, type of fire department, all these things go into the underwriting decision on whether to write a risk. And an insurer can change its mind at any point in time and say, from now on, we're not going to write any home that has a wood shingle roof. And so it wouldn't matter if you'd never had a loss and you have if you have a wood shingle roof, you'd be out. And that would be the end of it. It would be fair according to the rules because it is a risk-based decision. And as long as the insurance company then moving forward does that consistently, so every wood shingle home gets non-renewed, then they are being fair and not unfairly discriminatory, and they're allowed to do that. So they can reevaluate the level of risk, their appetite for risk at any given time, and start on a given date, move forward writing less risky homes. They have to give you 45 days notice of non-renewal, and they have to give you the reason that they are non-renewing you. But as long as they do that, it's a pretty short time frame, you have those 45 days to find coverage elsewhere. And that is getting harder for homes in high fire risk areas. Next slide, please. So one of the signs that we have that it's getting more difficult to find just standard insurance coverage is that the FAIR plan, which we call the insurer of last resort, which will basically write any homeowner that can't find coverage in the regular market. The FAIR plan, I say growth in parentheses or quote marks here. The FAIR plan actually is writing less business each year. It was set up to write mostly urban business after riots in the 60s, and that was the bulk of its book of business policies written. But now it's increasingly writing more risks in what we refer to as the WUI, the interface between wildland and urban areas like Marin County and much of the Bay Area. So that part of their book has grown by 11,000 policies in the last 5 years. Still small numbers, but we see it as an indicator of issues to come. And of course, this was by the end of 2018. Insurers in 2019 are seriously reevaluating what kind of risks they want to write for all the reasons that you've seen tonight, right? All those charts of growth of fire and much of it in the Sierra foothills and in wooded areas, right? They're seeing the same information that we're all seeing, and they're deciding they don't want to have another 200% loss ratio year. So it's just kind of how it works, and so I don't want to deliver bad news, but this is how insurance works. Next slide, please. Insurance rates are based on very recent loss experience, typically. So 2018, 2017, those years of losses are going into their loss history, and that's making them raise their rates. But the rates aren't necessarily going up for everybody. It's spread out based on where they think the most risk is. And of course, it's those homes that are in that same fire risk area that are absorbing the bulk of that rate. So while an insurer may take a 7% rate increase, that's a very common one, you would say, okay, everybody's going to get a 7% rate increase. No, some people may even get a decrease from that application because the area they live in has had very few losses, whereas some people in areas that have had high losses or a type of home that has had high losses, that will get maybe a 20% rate increase. So we're seeing wide swings in how much premium change there is for people. So next slide. So the bottom line is insurance reacts to risk, right? It's very reactionary. It's not a solution to anything other than your personal situation. It doesn't alleviate the risk. It doesn't take care of the forests or something to reduce the fire. It simply makes its decisions based on the information it sees, and it can walk away from the high-risk business anytime it chooses. So what we have to address is the same thing everyone has been telling you tonight, and I'm sure will continue to tell you as our next speakers come to the stage, is you have to address the risk. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and really what it tells you to do are things that, again, you've been talking about. Everything you can on your personal property to reduce the risk is what helps you guarantee that you will have coverage with the insurer that you have today or another insurer. Is do everything you can. That's all we can ask. But you also want your community to do all it can, right? You are dependent on your neighbors mitigating, doing the abatement. You're dependent on your fire department to enforce it. And I know nobody likes to be fined, but it's critical that this be done, right? It's just not somebody being difficult, your fire department being, dictatorial or something. They are looking out for everybody when they enforce those abatement standards, and it is critical to everyone that they do. Make sure you are covered for the full cost to rebuild your home. Nobody thinks their home will ever burn down, and thankfully the likelihood of it happening are minuscule, even with these recent years. Very tiny numbers, few thousand homes of millions of homes in California. But the people whose homes did burn down also thought they weren't going to be the ones who would lose their home either. And they hadn't kept track of where their insurance limit got to be where it is today. So I'd ask that all of you, make sure just some simple idea of how much is construction cost per square foot where in your area. Just find that out to get yourself in the ballpark of accurate. You just don't want to find out that your home is insured at $100 a square foot when it costs $500 a square foot to rebuild a home in this county, or $400. I don't know what it is for your particular part of the county, but make sure your limits are somewhere in the range of reasonable to rebuild your home. And then last thing I'll mention is if you have trouble with the renewal or costs going up, you need to shop around. The Department of Insurance, we have an 800 number. We have a website, insurance.ca.gov. On our website, there is a form or a screen, top 10 tips for finding insurance. It's how to find other insurers if yours was to non-renew you. If you have a farmer's agent and they non-renew you, they typically only represent one company. You have to go to an agent then that maybe represents multiple companies, or try Farmers or Allstate. But the idea is don't stop with your one insurer or the couple you've heard of on television if you do have issues. And you should be kind of premium comparing even now, at least every couple, 3 years. I know it's not something anyone looks forward to, like all insurance decisions, but it is one of the most valuable contracts you have because your home is one of the most valuable investments that you have in your life. So I just welcome you to contact the department if you have questions, and I hope you do all you can to mitigate the risk in your neighborhoods.
I don't know about you, but I'm learning a lot here. I was aware of the urban wildland interface, but I'd never heard it referred to as WUI. Here in Marin, it's pretty common to refer to the woo-woo zone, but now I guess we are the wooey-wooey zone. I want to remind you that there are cards and pencils. Please do decorate your questions. It will enhance the likelihood that they will be asked. And we will have people picking up the cards over the next few minutes. Our next speaker is Dr. Lisa M. Santora. She's a medical doctor with a master's in public health, the Deputy Public Health Officer for Marin County. She provides clinical oversight for public health emergency preparedness, communicable disease prevention and control, and the Marin County Jail. Prior to this role, Lisa was the Chief Medical Officer for the Beach Cities Health District. She's a family physician who's worked in federally qualified health centers across the country. And Dr. Santora is a graduate of Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School and completed residencies in preventive medicine and family medicine. Welcome, Dr. Lisa Santora.
So I'm a health officer, so if you need to stretch, you get some physical activity. We've been sitting for a while, free to stand up. When I moved here from Miami, I was leaving seasonal hurricanes, and I was not expecting to come to seasonal wildfires. So I should have maybe attended a Dr. Westerling lecture before coming to California. I knew my role would be in public health preparedness, but again, I was expecting earthquakes and knew they would come every once in a while. It was still an adjustment to be in California from the East Coast. And I was surprised on my first week at work that I was deployed through the Marin Medical Reserve Corps up to Lake County. The Medical Reserve Corps provided medical services at the shelter up in Lake County, and I was excited to do that, to be able to help our neighbors. But I really thought even then it was just something that affected Lake County. It wasn't something that was going to affect Marin County. And then October 2017 came and it changed my perception of my job. Prior to that day, and was it Sunday into Monday, the only time I'd been at the Marin Center, even though I drive by it a lot, was a very traumatic showing of the Nutcracker with a bunch of 5-year-olds, and I thought that was the only way I saw the Marin Center. It transformed that day on Monday when we opened the Marin Center, and it truly was an all-hands-on-deck opening of the Marin Center, of every part of our county coming together, including our community partners, to open the center to provide shelter for our neighbors north to Sonoma. And I'm a resident of Marin County, and I realized that day that it really could have been our hill, the hill behind our house, and it was truly a privilege to be able to provide a shelter for probably more than 500 residents at some point in Marin County, and to be a good neighbor. So you can jump ahead. So that was what that day started like. It was on October 4th, and we've had the statistics, but it was a big fire, and we were really fortunate, again, that it wasn't our hills, but there was a lot that now we've learned from it. You can jump ahead. Many of you, my role is in public health emergency preparedness, and you're probably very familiar now with how firefighters respond, but our systems also need to be prepared for a medical health response. And this is something our neighbors to the north, our Kaiser colleagues and our Sutter colleagues, never expected that they would be evacuating their hospitals from wildfires. The pictures are really dark, but it was by any means necessary. There were doctors that were putting patients into pickup trucks. You can see there's a fire behind and a team escorting a gurney out of the hospital. Those were the two kind of, I'd say, big-time evacuations, but as you can go down the slides, you will also see that we had 7 skilled nursing facilities evacuated. They were evacuated into general shelter. There wasn't a medical shelter, and our colleagues at the American Red Cross and their volunteers in Sonoma did a tremendous job in providing medical care to individuals who were at all stages of life, from newborn literally to in hospice care and awaiting their death. Fortunately, no one died in the shelters in Sonoma. Then we also had the Sonoma Developmental Center, which has a high need population with significant developmental delays, and access and functional needs also had to be evacuated. And again, there's just many heroes that day that figured out how to evac people safely into shelters. What we saw in Marin County is this is a tremendous opportunity for us to learn while it wasn't impacting us, on how can we prepare our community. And I think what stands out for me in this slide is really looking at access and functional needs in our community. We are an aging community. Many older adults are living by themselves in large homes up those roads, so we really have to look very holistically in community preparedness and making sure that we are considering our most vulnerable residents as we plan evacuations and engage in community preparedness activities. So you can see there is about 1,100 individuals with medical needs who are evacuated in the Sonoma fire. You can jump ahead. The only other interesting thing to say on that one with the fatalities in Sonoma, the hypothesis would have been people would have died further away from 101, the major corridor. Many of the deaths, when they studied where people did die in the Sonoma fatalities, were along the 101 corridor. So again, some of our assumptions in planning have to be corrected, and we have to understand that it's not just these remote paradise areas where there will be fatalities and impact, that we have to consider our entire county and our entire, especially our transportation corridors. So this is just a slide I like. It's where we evolved to a couple days on, where one, we were providing shelter for people who had needs, but it was truly, again, in partnership with all departments. You have our flagship of books, so people were, we had a lot of young children and families there, and we really tried to meet their sheltering needs while connecting them to resources to help them return back to Sonoma County. You can jump ahead. You can also start seeing that haze. That was from a public health perspective, we were doing two things that week. We were, one, providing medical services for shelter residents who people had needs from dialysis, where we were transporting people to dialysis, treating asthma attacks in the shelter. But then at that same week, our community became significantly concerned about air quality. And so from a public health perspective, we really were juggling how do we, with a limited staff, meet the medical needs for the shelter residents, while also on a parallel path engaging in public messaging and communication with our key stakeholders around air quality at this time. So we had the shelter open from Monday until Friday, and we were doing that in coordination with Sonoma County as we were learning as resources go online. One of the things that you may know or may not know is that if you get dislocated and you evacuate, the first step to recovery is identifying your local assistance center. Your county will stand up a local assistance center. They'll bring your insurance companies, Verizon, the county assessor. Everyone will come and to start providing you the tools that you need to start rebuilding your life and recovering. And that happens at home. And so when we learned that the Sonoma LAC, or Local Assistance Center, was standing up on September, we knew it was a priority to start to close our shelter and then help relocate residents back up to Sonoma so they can access those services. And you may have seen, I think on the Marin IJ or some of the Sonoma papers, there are long lines at those LACs. It is standing in line and starting to identify how do you get triaged for connecting to resources. We surveyed our residents to try and help understand how we can meet their needs. We found that the majority of them, as expected, were from Sonoma County. I mentioned earlier the majority of them had children, and we also co-located families with their pets. This was a sticky issue. The Red Cross had a policy of not sheltering with pets. We've been working closely with the Marin Humane Society and the Red Cross since this experience. We co-located. It was hard to say no, and I don't follow policies all the time. And if you can make sense, if you've just had this traumatic experience in your life, you want to be close to your pets. And that was a decision that we made, and again, with the support of our county to be able to co-locate. Since then, though, we've worked with the Red Cross in preparation if we do have to stand up again, that if it's a Red Cross shelter that stands up in Marin County or a county shelter, we will have a co-location policy to allow people to stay with their pets. And that's something that has developed. It's been a lesson learned from that event. We also found that people could return back to their home. Many of our residents could return. The reason why they were staying in Marin is they perceived that the air quality in Marin was better than it was in Sonoma. And if you remember that week, the winds actually shifted. And there was a day where the quality of air in Marin was much, much worse than it was up in Sonoma County. And so then we realized we needed to educate our shelter residents about the air quality and help them see that the air quality had improved and it would be better. Not only it was safe for them to relocate and they wouldn't experience adverse effects from air quality. And it's also we had a lot of bilingual staff. It was many of our residents were monolingual Spanish, so that was their primary language. And they were waiting for the government to say it was okay to go back home. And so again, learning how we needed to communicate the message so they felt reassured to return home. You can jump to the next slide. Okay, so you would have thought we learned. After that event in 2017, we realized that we needed to be prepared for wildfires. We needed to prepare to stand up shelters. We were not expecting, from a public health perspective, that fire in Butte County would bring down the level of smoke and particulate matter and create this visage in Marin County, and that we'd have to address the air quality index and the air quality concerns for residents in Marin County. You can jump to the next slide. So many of you have already seen this now. We had to make some tough decisions. Should school close? Should school stay open? From an equity lens, for many of our children in Marin County, the safest place for air quality is in school. And so closing school would potentially have children stay at home unsupervised and have higher exposure to poor air quality. We're fortunate to have a tremendous partnership with this superintendent of the Marin County Office of Education, Mary Jane Burke, and really understand the dynamics that by midweek, end of the week, the teachers were fatiguing. Imagine being inside. Again, I didn't do well at the Nutcracker for an hour. So maybe I'm biased. But children weren't allowed out on the regular recreation schedule. They had to stay inside. The teachers were fatigued by the end of that week. So it was a combination of air quality as well as recognizing we had stretched our school staff. We did stretch them, and we closed school. We supported the closure of the school, not from an air quality perspective per se, but we supported the closure of the school on that Friday. Since then, we've been partnering with Marin County Office of Education and other community partners to draft policy. We didn't have a wildfire air quality policy for Marin County. It's in draft version now. We didn't also have a heat policy for Marin County until 2 years ago. Again, looking at that first slide, we should have known it was coming, but we weren't prepared. Jump to the next slide. Yeah, so that was a dramatic. I was fortunate to be in Hawaii for the first part of that week. So it was very dramatic to come from Maui on Wednesday. Matt Willis, our health officer, took the brunt of managing the response in 2018, and arriving in Oakland at nighttime and just seeing what our community was experiencing. And it was dramatic, it was disconcerting, and it was really affecting the health and well-being of our residents. We're now launching research to see if when we have to match our air quality index with hospitalizations and admissions, so we can see there's an assumption, there's a hypothesis as that air quality is worsening that we're having more hospitalizations, more medical visits, and now we'll be evaluating that countywide to inform our decision making. So let me see. Mask protection, that's a difficult thing. Those N95 masks don't fit children. People with obstructive lung disease or asthma can also be adversely affected by wearing masks. So some of our public health recommendations really, you have to to weigh find that balance and strengthen the balance of the right messaging of the benefits, the harms or benefits of recommending universal masks for our community. It's not as simple as wearing a mask and providing reassurance to people that everything's going to be okay. The other thing we were challenged to do that week is identifying those clean indoor air locations. We had locations that we knew we had recommended people from the season before when it was hot where they should go, but confirming what is the definition of a clean air location. For example, not all of our libraries have air conditioning, so we had to, again, identify where can we direct our community if they're feeling overwhelmed by the poor air quality, where are the resources they can go to find relief? And again, we're still learning and still trying to improve our ability to educate the public and increase their awareness of what they can do when there is poor air quality. The other thing that changed, our REST program concluded last year, and we relaunched a new severe weather emergency shelter for persons experiencing homelessness. So in our concept, when we were developing that, we were just thinking about rain. And it's not just about rain anymore. One of our criteria for opening now is an air quality index, knowing that for persons experiencing homelessness, to stay out all night would impact their health significantly. I think this is the last slide you can jump to. So lessons learned, it's in close. Definitely register on Alert Marin and Neill. We use those for public health alerts as well. You can sign up for air quality alerts yourself. These are some tips that you can have for just trying to make sure your home is, can be as much of a clean air space as possible. And then from a health officer perspective, and just listening to everyone today, I think the next guidance would be connecting with your neighbors. As I mentioned, our community is aging, and it's great the work we're doing with FireWise, but we need to know who our neighbors are, and neighbors who might be more vulnerable, you need to connect with your neighbors as well to have an evacuation plan and to consider evacuating earlier when we do have those red flag days. We're going to be challenged over the next year with the next year and beyond with the public safety power shutoffs, and so we're going to be learning a lot from that. But again, having a plan ready to go, having a family communication plan, having an emergency kit with your medications and your glasses, and then knowing your neighbors so you can support each other. So that's it. Thank you very much.
We are pleased that our Assembly member, Mark Levine, has dropped in this evening, and we want to invite him to make a few comments, give us a little bit of the Sacramento perspective. And Mark, if I may, and if you care to, I'd be interested in your comments on PG&E and the liability issues of ratepayers and taxpayers, and if there's any talk further about public ownership of PG&E.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone who's here tonight. There's just amazing information, so thank you to Bell Cole, thank you to OFA, thank you everyone who organized this, the speakers tonight. We could be on a road show every night for Here Into Your Eternity across the North Bay, but the whole state, and we will always need to educate people about the fires as well as flooding as well, because I've seen the Department of Insurance, they've been up here in the North Bay quite a bit, and we will be doing, it's funny we talk about fires and flooding together. We will be doing a hearing on floods tomorrow in the legislature as well. Right as the fires hit in 2017, my wife and I inquired about our own coverage, and we learned very quickly that we were underinsured. Like 75% of the people who lost their homes in the North Bay fires that year, and it inspired legislation that and a number right after 2017. I did 3 bills to protect insurance policyholders. One, to make sure that their insurance companies would every 2 years update them on what their full coverage would be. It didn't require them anyone to buy the full coverage, but that someone should be informed about what full coverage is and have an opportunity to protect themselves. We also made sure that in the event of a fire, if you lost your policy, you could get a digital copy of that policy. Ridiculous to think that we would need to pass a law to make sure that policyholders could get their policy, but nonetheless it was required, and I authored that law as well. I also authored a law that allowed for someone to relocate or rebuild or buy a new house somewhere completely different from where they lost their home, because that was a problem where people weren't getting their policy payout unless they were able to rebuild quickly enough. We were able to change that. So in Sacramento, of course, the legislature has addressed a number of other issues, but this year I'm doing 3 other bills related not just to PG&E or fire specifically, but to, bless you, but from the experience of the fires. So in the Mendocino Complex fires that were at that time the largest fire in state history, we had fire agencies from across California coming to aid in our mutual aid system, which is so wonderful and so helpful. And the Santa Clara County Fire Department found out, as many departments have found out, that when they got there, somehow they had gone over their data plan. And so they were throttled by their service provider. And so I have a bill that's up in the Assembly tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I'll be up in Sacramento. I've had unanimous bipartisan support to make sure that in an event of a disaster or in a state of emergency, that no data service provider can ever throttle first responders again. And yeah, thank you. It's AB 1699, and so again, I'm grateful for the unanimous bipartisan support. I've also introduced AB 747, which asks that cities and counties, when they're updating their general plans or their hazard plans, that they have to take into account ingress and egress, evacuation routes essentially, for how people are going to get out of where they are. What we found in Paradise was that people couldn't get out soon enough. They had thought that they would evacuate in zones if it was a normal fire, but we don't have normal fires anymore. And in fact, they had narrowed their roads. And so they hadn't anticipated needing to evacuate as quickly as they did. This legislation will hopefully allow for our communities to plan a little bit more effectively for these catastrophes. And then if we get to what Peter had wanted me to, he kind of put the bait out there to talk about PG&E. I have another bill, AB 1166, to make sure that when people are doing work and they're digging, that PG&E is able to get to them, a response to them about whether or not there are gas pipelines quicker than what they've been doing. And so we've seen there was an audit of the system, and the system had not been working, and people were actually going ahead and doing their work after they had asked for a report about where those pipelines were, never getting a response. And so we're gonna require that type of a response as well. That just passed unanimously through the first 2 policy committees that was in. We have a lot more work to do. I'm this weekend clearing weeds and cutting some trees back from my eaves, so that defensible space probably cannot be repeated enough. And then PG&E, that's a big question. So we had a bill last year that I voted against that was essentially the PG&E bailout. And after the North Bay fires, everyone said we're not going to make ratepayers pay for this. And then they essentially said, to avoid bankruptcy, we'll make ratepayers pay for this. And I said, well, this isn't gonna actually work. It's not going to help PG&E avoid bankruptcy. And in fact, what will happen is ratepayers are going to be on the hook in the bad years when there are these catastrophic fires, but in the good years, when PG&E is profiting hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, they don't have to pay anything else. And of course, what we saw was that PG&E went and sought bankruptcy protection even before they were found liable for any of the fires. And so it didn't protect us. They had sought to change some of the liability laws, one that's called inverse condemnation, which some will say puts too much responsibility on them if they are following all of the laws and all of the procedures that they're supposed to be following. I think what we have to confront most of all is just that we have an annual wildfire season, that climate change is hastening these wildfire seasons, and in fact these wildfires are as destructive and as powerful as they could ever be. and that they're not in the past, they're also in the future. And that's why we're here tonight. And I'm just extraordinarily grateful to see all of you here, to hear about what we can do to protect ourselves. But also, I think what we should also do is feel some confidence that when we have the speakers that we have here talking about how our communities are working to protect us or making plans to protect us, that we've got extraordinarily talented people who are really working hard to make sure that we can protect our communities. And I'm grateful for that leadership from the county, from Insurance Commissioner Lara's office, from Fire, County Fire, and our local city fire departments as well, that are really looking out for us. But we need to listen to some of the messages that we're hearing about clearing defensible space and having sometimes difficult conversations with your neighbors. If their bushes and their trees are a little bit too much, that we have to talk to one another about that as well. So I want to say thank you again for organizing this. And please, if there's anything at all that I can do that I can be helpful with, please do not hesitate to call my office. Have a good night.
I want to ask, is there anyone here from my FIREsafe committee on Bald Hill? Don't see anybody tonight, but we did set up a committee last fall, and Todd Lando came and talked to our group. And he really was very helpful, informative, and impressed on us the urgency of our tasks without resorting to fear. Todd has firefighting in Marin in his DNA. His father was a fire chief. He's worked 28 years in the fire service, 19 years as a wildland and municipal firefighter. He is the executive coordinator of FIREsafe Marin, a forestry and wildlife prevention and communications consultant, and wildfire hazard and vegetation management specialist for the Kentfield Fire District and Central Marin Fire Department. He studied forestry and wildlife management at the University of Montana and earned a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and urban planning from Sonoma State University. He is an NFPA certified wildfire mitigation specialist. Please welcome Todd Lando.
Thanks everyone for being here. I want to introduce you to a discussion about Marin's fire history. I don't think we can have an informed discussion about climate change and how it impacts or potentially will impact future wildfires without understanding where we've been in Marin. The next slide, please. Marin, in most of Northern California, most of California exists in a Mediterranean climate. We have a summer drought every year. We go through a period where there's no rainfall, and that's largely contributed to an environment where we have plants and vegetation that's adapted to wildfire, that sees wildfire, because we see a drought every year, typically from May until October or November until it rains. It's important to understand that our fire season is getting longer, dramatically longer. Our fire season is 84 days longer today than it was just in the 1970s. That's a dramatic increase. I've seen that increase over the course of my career and anticipate that that will continue. In Marin, some of the factors that have contributed to wildfires over the year are daily weather patterns that we see frequently in the fall before we get into the rainy season. Northeast wind conditions, we call them Diablo winds here because they come from the direction of Mount Diablo in Southern California. They call them Santa Ana winds, but they're the same phenomenon, the same dry, hot winds that typically drive wildfires. Next slide, please. This is a list of major wildfires that have occurred in Marin over the last 160 years. What's important to see here, these are fires that are typically over 1,000 acres. They're large fires between 1,000 and 50,000 acres. There's a handful of fires on this list that were smaller than that, but were difficult to control for other reasons. So they made an impact, they made the list of major wildfires. Most of these fires made national headlines. If you live in Marin, and I think everybody in this room, perhaps except Leroy, lives in Marin, You live in an area that was impacted by one of these wildfires. It's just a fact. When you walk out, you'll see we've got a map. It was on the last slide, but it's a hand-drawn map from 1934, hand-drawn by E.B. Gardner. He was the first fire warden of the Tamalpais Forest Fire District. He drew it from the top of Mount Tamalpais, from the fire lookout tower. He drew all of the fires, the boundaries of all of the fires that occurred over a 17-year period while he worked on top of Mount Tam. Many of those fires are captured here. It was one of the worst periods for wildfires in Marin's history. Next slide, please. I think what we're all really concerned about, the reason our anxiety is high, is this change we've seen since probably 2015, maybe since 1991 with the Oakland Hills fire. But a trend towards urban conflagrations. And Marin has a history of fires much like that, going back 100 years. 1919, this is the 100th anniversary of a fire. It's known as the Hurricane Gulch Fire. There's nobody living who remembers this fire. Happened in Sausalito, burned dozens of homes. Each of the fires shown here burned dozens to hundreds of homes in Marin, probably in communities that you live in today. 1923 was the largest fire we know of in Marin history, 50,000 acres. It burned through central Marin. It burned from Novato to Fairfax and over the Bolinas Ridge into Bolinas in about 48 hours. Coincidentally, about the same size as the Tubbs fire was in 2017 in Santa Rosa. And it burned on the same day, the very same day, in September 17th, as what was known for many years as the Great Fire in the city of Berkeley, until we bumped it out in 1991 with a new, even greater fire. That fire burned 900 homes in Berkeley. At the same time, a major wildfire was burning in Marin. And at the same time, 3 major fires were burning in Sonoma County and Napa County, and hundreds of fires were burning that day across Northern California, one of the darkest days for fires in California history. 1929, just 6 years later, the Great Fire in the city of Mill Valley burned 110 homes, over 1,000 acres. That's actually the only fire shown up here that didn't happen late in the season, in the fall. That fire happened on the 4th of July. 1945, a 30,000 acre fire burned from what's now Samuel P. Taylor Park over Mount Tamalpais. The 2 of the plane crashes that you can go look at on top of Mount Tam occurred when the pilots coming back from the war in the Pacific saw the smoke and crashed into each other in the smoke from that fire. They both survived, both pilots. In 1995, recent history that many of you probably remember, the Vision Fire in West Marin, 12,000 acres, 45 homes burned in the month of October. Next slide, please. So the history of wildfires has led to a history of fire suppression. That's one of the factors that's contributed to the fuel conditions that we see today. We've been putting out fires largely successfully since the 1930s and 40s. 1941, the Tamalpais Forest Fire District became the Marin County Fire Department. Tamalpais Forest Fire District was the first forest fire district of its kind, a tax authority dedicated to fighting wildfires. It was the first of its kind in the United States, and it's right here. So when you live in a place where they had to create a special district just to fight forest fires, you ought to be thinking about the history and what that means for the future. Next slide, please. So, FIREsafe Marin. I'm the executive coordinator at FIREsafe Marin. We're a nonprofit. We were formed in the weeks or months after the Oakland Hills fire in 1991. We called ourselves early on a FIREsafe Council. We were one of the first in the nation. There are FIREsafe Councils in all 50 states now. And we offer a number of programs, some of them directly related, I think, in ways to the discussion of climate change, and I want to, all of them related to wildfires, so I want to introduce you to some of those programs. Next slide, please. Our FireWise USA program, I appreciate all the other speakers who mentioned it. I think everybody mentioned their FireWise USA program. Peter B. Collins lives in one of our most active FireWise communities in San Anselmo. This is a fantastic program. It's a national framework that recognizes communities that are working towards reducing their risk. Joel mentioned the insurance implications. Some insurers are authorized to give insurance discounts to homeowners who live in fire-wise communities. We have anecdotal evidence, and I'm going to say that Joel somewhat confirmed it. It's still anecdotal, but that insurers consider that, and it may affect whether or not your policies are renewed or canceled, or you're able to find coverage. This is a fantastic program that builds community, brings people together, and Marin leads the nation. This slide is now about 3 weeks old. We now have 41 sites as of yesterday in Marin County. These are individual neighborhoods, communities, locations that have gone through a process of recognition. They receive this national recognition, and they're committed to working every year, moving forward, to reducing their risk. Next slide. So some of our other programs, we offer an extensive education program. We've held 15 of these classes. Living with Fire is the title. In just the last month, we intend to hold more going forward. Several are scheduled on our website, firesafemarin.org/events. Register. This is a 2-hour education program, about 90 minutes of discussion. We're going to talk to you about evacuation preparedness, home hardening, how to make your home more resistant to igniting. We'll talk about defensible space and what it means, what vegetation you can have and what vegetation you should avoid in your yards, how to build a safe landscape around your homes. And we'll talk to you about organizing your community. We'll introduce you even further to that FireWise program, how you can do that in your own neighborhood. Next slide. We offer neighborhood level programs, funding for work in your community to reduce the risk. One of our popular programs is a Chipper Day program. We historically provided funding to any neighborhood that asked. If you came to us 5 years ago and said, we'd like to hold a Chipper Day, we'd like to hold an event, we'd like funding to help us with the project in our neighborhood, we would have provided that funding to you. We now can only provide funding to neighborhoods that are organized through the FireWise USA program because we don't have enough funding anymore to meet the demand. The demand is strong. We expect to have 60 communities organized through that FireWise program at the end of this year. We don't have the funds to say that we can give money to every neighborhood that asks. We're working hard to find the funding to make sure that that happens, to make sure we can support you. But if you want access to these programs, you've got to be involved with our organization, and you have to be involved with the FireWise USA program. Next slide, please. This is our favorite program. And probably the one that most directly relates to climate change. It's a sustainable program with some fantastic carbon sequestration benefits. These aren't actually our goats, but I presume our goats looked just like this when they were younger. Everybody loves this slide. So next slide. Goat grazing, we found through research, Chief Neill mentioned the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, which looked at risk and hazard throughout the county and proposed locations, potential places where we could do work to most successfully mitigate future wildfires. And we've looked hard at some of those locations. And through FireSafe Marin, which is an organization that brings different agencies and homeowners, private and public enterprise together to talk about and find unique ways to reduce wildfire risk, we came together and realized that one of the best approaches for us to remove vegetation on large areas was through goat grazing. The Marin County Parks and Open Space District, who's represented here tonight, one of the first partners. They've used goats extensively over the years. FireSafe Marin helped bring a variety of local agencies, fire departments, towns, private landowners, large landowners like ranches, school districts, public and private schools are all working together right now for our second year on a tremendous project in Central Marin that will touch 8 communities. It will reduce risk over approximately 500 acres this year, more than 10 miles of fuel reduction created by goats, focusing on areas that are most at risk. This is a photograph of some of the fuel reduction that happens right in people's backyards where it matters the most, where it's most likely to mitigate the potential damage from fires. Next slide. This is a nice illustration. This photograph was just taken last week. This shows the example as you look from the top of the image to the bottom. The top of the image was grazed by the goats for 24 hours. They've moved into a new pasture in the middle where they've been grazing for about 12 hours. The bottom of the image, the darkest green, has not been touched and won't be touched by the goats. We're following routes and locations where we think will have the most impact. Next slide. These are the goats. This is where they are right now. They're working in Sleepy Hollow. There are 3 herds of 400 goats working in different locations, all on the same project. This particular herd is 400 goats working in Sleepy Hollow, heading towards San Anselmo and San Rafael as we speak. Next slide, please. So we're fundraising. We're looking to support this program. The vast majority of the work is already funded. The work that's being done today is being paid for by local agencies and big landowners. But we have an opportunity to keep these goats working when they're done, probably late June or early July. We'd love it if you were willing to support this program. If you text the word GOAT to 77453, you'll have an opportunity to donate to support them and keep them going. If you donate $100, you can name one of those goats. And believe it or not, you're actually naming the goat. There's a record of every goat with an ear tag, and that name will stick with that goat for the rest of its life. Next slide. So we work on other programs, not just the goat grazing. We manage grants. We've managed about $4 million of grants in the last 5 years. We were just awarded $1 million grant from CAL FIRE to address vegetation management and vegetation where it encroaches onto roadways and potentially blocks people's evacuation routes. This is going to focus again on 8 communities in Central Marin, from Mill Valley to Fairfax. Each one of the communities that are going to see this work and get this attention are part of our FireWise USA program, and it's critical to us when we manage big projects like this countywide that the residents who live in the area who are impacted by it understand the risk, are working in concert with us. When we work on evacuation routes, we need to know that the homeowners are doing work around their own homes, addressing the vegetation around their homes, addressing the ignitability of the homes themselves by hardening the structures, retrofitting things like the vents that you can see on our table at the back table. And we've got 2 great volunteers who've been at probably a dozen or more events in the last week. They're devoting a lot of their time away from their families to be here, to be with folks who are interested in this topic. Next slide, please. So I can't overemphasize how important the community building is to this. You need to work with your neighbors in your community to really make an impact. We find over and over again that the most impact we can make is when neighbors work together, when you reach over the fence and work with the neighbor who has that tree. I know every one of you has got a neighbor whose tree you're concerned about. The best way to address that is not to call your local fire department necessarily. Oftentimes what we find is walking over, crossing that fence, bringing a bottle of wine over, and having a one-on-one discussion with your neighbor is the best approach. So thank you all for being here. Appreciate your support.
We have one more speaker, and then I encourage you to stay with us if you possibly can. We will be addressing questions from the audience, and I want to thank people who have submitted them. Our final speaker is Marin County Supervisor Kate Sears. She's represented Southern Marin since 2011. She serves on many boards, including the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, the Golden Gate Bridge District, the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority Governing Board, and she currently chairs the board of Marin Clean Energy. And before this, she was a Deputy Attorney General for the state of California. One of the interesting things that she sponsored, and maybe some of you experienced it, was the kiosks with the binoculars. You know, you go to a Vista Point and put 50 cents in and you get to scan the horizon. Well, these were set up to give us a preview of sea level rise. And I recall being on the bike walk path in Mill Valley and turning it toward Tam High School. And the school was above water, but the football stadium was suitable for water polo. So I thought it was a very instructive project, and I appreciate that. She's been working on sea level rise and climate change issues. She's on the county's Climate Action Plan Implementation Subcommittee. She leads the county's Bay Wave Sea Level Rise Vulnerability and Adaptation Initiative. And if we're going to build us some wall, I think it should be sea walls. Will you please welcome Kate Sears?
I want to thank you all for hanging in here so long with so many speakers, but I must confess one of the few contentious issues I have with my colleague Katie Rice is that she gets all the goats in her neighborhood, and I haven't gotten any of them in southern Marin yet. So this is something we're going to fix. So I wanted to focus your attention on this picture, not simply because it's a pretty picture, but because of how densely settled, this is an example of Tam Valley in southern Marin, of how densely settled it is and the incredible amount of tree cover and vegetation we have now, because I want to take us back just a little bit. Next slide. This is a picture of the very same area in 1938, and you can see how much is changed in our community, and it's certainly not just this part of southern Marin over the years as people have moved in, built their houses, planted trees, developed their gardens, and created communities. Next slide. And so that has led to so many of us being next to the WUI, the Wildland-Urban Interface. We've seen this slide before, but I want you to keep this picture in mind as we go to the next slide. This is the impact, obviously, on our county of 3 feet of sea level rise. It's easy to see the impact on the bay side of Marin. It's harder to see the impact on West Marin. And the reason I like these slides side by side is that obviously our county has 2 very significant impacts of climate change that really unite all of us as a county: fire and flood, and together that's pretty much all of our county. Next slide, please. We've heard a lot tonight about the impact on climate change and the more frequent fires. This chart really made an impact on me. And what this is, it's a graph from a current modeling study which shows the areas burned in the western United States since 1984 is roughly twice as large as it would have been without the impact of climate change. Obviously, our warmer temperatures, our variable snowpack, our earlier snow melt caused by climate change is all contributing to this impact. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about it? That square in the middle that you probably have a hard time reading is the grand jury report that just came out. That's a very interesting read. You may wonder why the Marin County Climate Action Plan is here, and the reason for that is explained by the cover that's on the left. That's Wildfires and Climate Change, California's Energy Future, a report from Governor Newsom's strike force that just came out on April 12th of 2019. It's a fascinating report, and one of the things that it says is this: California's recent experience of catastrophic wildfires confirms the critical importance of climate change mitigation efforts. As the state moves quickly to respond to the devastating impacts of climate change and become more resilient, we must remain focused on addressing climate change through clean energy policy. So let's talk a little bit about greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. Here's a slide that I simply can't show too often, which is the bulk of Marin's greenhouse gas emissions come from, 90% of those emissions come from the use of fossil fuels in our homes and businesses, our cars and our trucks. We've made great strides to reduce those emissions, including choosing 100% renewable energy. And I don't want to minimize the progress we've made. But those efforts with our climate action plans that all of our jurisdictions have are really only the tip of the iceberg. Achieving California's climate goals means generating electricity from 100% clean renewable resources instead of fossil fuels and electrifying everything, our buildings, our transportation, everything. Next slide, please. You've all heard the phrase carbon footprint. I particularly like this slide because it shows that heavy footprint at the left and all of the actions that add to a carbon-intensive lifestyle. and all of the lifestyle choices on the right that help reduce our own impact on the planet. And this is really all about choice and the choices we make. Next slide. So let's look a little more closely at Marin County. This is each of our jurisdictions. It's probably kind of hard to read. It's stretching from Bolinas on the left to Ross on the right. And I don't want to point fingers at anybody because really we all contribute to climate change just by living in a first world country and with first world expectations. But this shows how the things that all of us do and the way that we live impacts the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we generate. The light blue bar at the top represents the services we use and the traffic that's generated by the people we hire to take care of our homes and our belongings. Below that is purple. That's goods. That's all those packages that we get from Amazon. Below that, the green, that's the food we eat. How far it has to travel to get from our farms to our plates makes a difference, as you know, and that's why we all shop at farmers markets. And I hope you also know that food waste is the #3 contributor to global warming. The red bar is our houses. And there we have to ask ourselves, are our houses energy efficient? My house was built in the 1880s, and I can tell you I've got some work to do. Have we changed out all of our light bulbs to LEDs? These are small steps that we can take. Finally, at the bottom, deep blue, that's transportation. How many of you drove here tonight in a gas-powered vehicle? How many took a carpool? Obviously, all of the transportation choices, including airfare, the airplanes we take, makes a difference. Next slide. So what if we really got serious about this and we decided that we want to reduce our emissions by 90% below 1990 levels? There's some great things that we have to do that are shown on this list, and I'm just going to point out a couple of them. It would mean that 100% are greenhouse gas-free renewable electricity for all uses. It would mean a 75% reduction of lawn and garden equipment emissions. That's something that I think sometimes none of us really think about. It'd mean a 50% reduction in waste. We really need to think realistically about what it would take for us to move even one of these changes forward. And just for a little bit of context, our county's climate action plan establishes a target of 30% reduction below 1990 levels by 2020. Next slide, please. So what are we really talking about, and what have we done so far? Between 2005 and 2016, we've reduced emissions by 22.9%, or 376,827 metric tons of CO2 emissions annually. But that means we still have to reduce 1,223,173 metric tons of carbon emissions every year to meet the 90% below 1990 levels goals. Now, these numbers can seem not just daunting, but maybe just a little bit paralyzing. But really they're not, because we're going to tackle this challenge the same way that we're going to prepare for increased fire danger. And that's by starting right here in our backyard. Next slide, please. So here in Marin, I hope all of you know this, we have launched Drawdown Marin to do our part locally to address the challenge of dramatically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. To the extent possible, we want to eliminate fossil fuels across all sectors, electrifying everything, powering everything using renewable energy, and sequestering as much carbon using existing as well as innovative strategies as we possibly can. This is a climate mitigation strategy that's relevant to fire, to flood, and to health. And it has the same urgency and the same need for focused attention. And you can see the 6 focus areas that are what we are focusing on in Drawdown Marin. Next slide, please. And here's some of the things that you can do, actions you can take right away, and there's more information on the table at the back. I hope you, if you haven't grabbed that information, you will do so on your way out and take it with you. Next slide. So I want to talk just for a minute about resilience. The resilience of nature, of individuals, and of our communities. The photo on the right, as you can see, it was taken 6 months after the Woolsey fire in Los Angeles and Ventura counties. And you can see the regrowth that came back after the Woolsey fire. Nature is resilient if it's not stressed too far before it's hit by a fire disaster. People are resilient too, and they're even more so if we act together. One of the things that was most sobering, I think, for most of us in the Camp Fire was that over 60% of the victims of that fire were aged 60 and older or disabled. And one of the reasons I think that resonated for many of us was maybe there wasn't a strong enough sense of community. Maybe people didn't know their neighbors as well as they should have. Maybe they weren't aware of who in their neighborhood needed that extra help during an emergency. It's just crucially important, as other speakers have said, that you get to know your neighbors and you mobilize and you organize your street. Next slide, please. And so after fires, the conversation focuses on how can we rebuild and how fast can we rebuild, because people want to go back to their communities. But as an area rebuilds after a fire, or even if we're just remodeling, we need to take advantage, we need to seize that opportunity to stop using fossil fuels. We need to make the commitment to policies and ordinances that make sure we electrify Marin by switching from our gas-fired appliances, our furnaces, our water heaters, clothes dryers, stoves, to appliances that are electric. And we need to make sure that that electricity is 100% renewable. These are steps that will increase our resilience of our community to the fire danger ahead. Next slide, please. It's also important that we recognize the power in our plants, and especially in native plants. We can have beautiful gardens that help sequester carbon, while at the same time being fire-wise. Our plants and tree roots are our best resource for pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. Nature underpins all dimensions of human health and provides inspiration and learning, as well as physical and psychological experiences that are really central to our quality of life. That's why we planted all these trees in our neighborhoods. Let's be sure to sustain and protect our natural systems and our biodiversity with nature-friendly climate adaptation and mitigation that is appropriate to our communities and our neighborhoods. Next slide. While we recognize the potential for catastrophic fire, as well as the severe impacts of a changing climate, we can make the choices necessary to reduce our carbon footprint, and we can make the decisions needed to protect our families and communities. As the young climate activist Greta Thunberg, who is pictured here, said in a recent speech, avoiding climate breakdown will require cathedral thinking. We must lay the foundation while we may not know exactly how to build the ceiling. Sometimes we just simply have to find a way. Next slide. So we know the choices we have to make, we know the actions we need to take, and we must act now with the same kind of urgency that you feel about preparing your homes for fire. We must act with that same sense of urgency to reduce our carbon emissions and to make sure that our communities are truly safe from fire and from sea level rise as well. So thank you for being here.
Ready when you are. Thank you. I want to thank all the people in the audience who submitted questions here tonight. And we understand that the hour is late, and you may hear your question answered if you watch the replay on Marin TV on Comcast Channel 26 at a date to be named later. I have some really good questions from the audience and some that we prepared in advance for the panelists. Are any insurers prioritizing or incentivizing fire-wise neighborhoods?
As far as I know right now, my apologies, USAA is the only insurer that provides discounts in California to residents in a FireWise community. I've been told that CSAA and State Farm are looking into it, but I have to be approved by, I think, through Joel's organization. Is that correct?
Yeah, rate discounts are approved by the Department of Insurance. Actually, I think the FAIR Plan has a FireWise community discount if you do end up with the FAIR Plan. But I would say even for insurers that don't offer a discount directly, to be eligible for insurance when they're looking at a community-wide abatement effort, even if it's not direct, it makes an impact on your eligibility and rate.
We covered a lot of important topics this evening. One that I would like to add with a question from a participant in the audience. Are there existing evacuation routes that have been identified and that can be found online or shared with neighborhood groups? Todd, when you spoke to our group, you emphasized that in a firestorm situation, that fire trucks would not be coming up narrow, hilly roads to enable evacuation. So could you thumbnail for us evacuation plans and where people can access information for their neighborhood?
I think I'll let Christie maybe address the bulk of that, but fire engines will be going to fight the fire. I don't want to leave the wrong impression, but when the fire department requests an evacuation of a neighborhood, they're aware of that, and they will not send fire engines into an area where they think the fire engines moving into that community might impede evacuation. That's part of the planning process and the management process of a fire. But as far as individual evacuation plans, you want to talk about that?
Please, Christie.
So the entire county is mapped in what we call mutual threat zone maps, which indicate all the communities, the roads, the streets, the houses, and the main transportation corridors, as well as maybe some of the secondary. So we have those in our trucks as fire people and law enforcement. Law enforcement is responsible for implementing those evacuations. We inform the law enforcement agencies about what we think the fire is going to do to help inform our decisions about which way to move people in or out. So the maps right now are being we're taking all the gate code information off of them and kind of cleaning them up a little bit so that they will be posted through Marin Map. But right now, all those roads and access areas are all the roads that you guys already use. And so there's nothing secret or magic about the evacuation road maps. It's just areas where we've identified the main primary corridors like Sir Francis Drake, things like that. And what our goal is to get you out of the hills and down to the valleys, onto the main roads, or to areas where there's no vegetation to burn or threaten you.
And
Can I
Supervisor
add
Sears,
on to
you
that?
had some issues with mudslides in Sausalito recently.
We sure did, and I wanted to add on to that comment because we've had a lot of conversations about fires in the last 6 months, in particular 9 months, and one of the things that really struck me was a comment, I think it was by the Southern Marin Fire Chief, and he said, you know, so often when we think about evacuation plans, we're thinking about where we're driving in our vehicle, but really we also should be thinking about what's the route? How would we evacuate where we live on foot if we needed to do that? And that really made an impact on me. Obviously, it's not practical for everyone, but I think for most of us, it's good to have those alternatives in mind of what our choices are. The mudslides were fascinating. I'm not sure what you want me to address on that. If anyone has had a chance to go down to Sausalito and drive Sausalito Boulevard and look up and look down and be so glad that you don't live in one of the houses there. where the mudslide came down from the GGNRA, and it was really about 12 years ago, just a little further up the road, that there was a mudslide that took out 2 houses and killed a couple of people. And so fortunately there was no loss of life in this one, but really dramatic. And so thinking about the larger climate change impacts, it is important to look around in your neighborhood and think about those other vulnerabilities from water as well as from fire.
Thank you. Question for Professor Westerling. When you recommend forest thinning, do you account for the carbon sequestration of what you have thinned?
So we actually have been modeling the interaction between the fuels management, the climate change, wildfire, and carbon stock in the Sierras in particular. And you lose some carbon by taking it out of the forest, but it's more than made up for by reducing the severity and the size of future fires. And so what happens is you end up with a much more stable carbon stock in the forest over time if you treat aggressively now.
What about raking the forests?
What about what?
Raking the forest.
Raking the forest. Well, you know, in Finland, they're really good at that, but they have a very different climate than we do.
And a more serious question. We know that there are hundreds of millions of dead trees in California, mostly in forest land and federal land in the Sierra.
Yeah.
Do we have an estimate of the number of dead trees in Marin?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I'm sure there's a satellite-based product that could give you an idea. But what we've been looking at is the impact of those dead trees on fire risk. And there's short-term changes, but they're quite minor, it seems like. So what burns in a high-severity canopy fire is the needles, the fine fuels up in the canopy of the tree. Mm-hmm. And once those are dead, they actually start losing some of their volatiles, and then they fall out. And so the risk of those high severity fires decreases after the trees die. And then you can maybe get, for a short time, a high severity surface fire, a higher severity surface fire than you would have gotten because of higher fuels on the surface. But again, it's really temporary. Mm-hmm. The problem is that all those standing dead trees, those heavy fuels, we don't have a way to model, we don't have currently a fuel model for that to understand how that would burn. Decades from now, when they've dried out and they're fallen over and they're just piled up on the landscape and the new vegetation that comes up around them gets dry in a particularly dry year, it's like logs and kindling. And the best analogy we have for that would be something like the firebombing of Dresden in World War II. So part of the 5th climate assessment is, for the state of California, we'll be modeling those fuels by burning things like that in laboratories and wind tunnels.
Could you pull that mic a little closer to you? That's why we didn't.
All right. So we'll be trying to create new fuel models to understand how this new matrix of fuels in our forests is going to respond to climate change.
The eucalyptus trees in Marin are probably less of a hazard than what you imagine. We don't see fires carrying commonly up into the canopy of those trees the way you might see if you've seen news footage from the vast eucalyptus forests in Australia, the way they were burning just during their summer over our winter. That said, there is a big hazard associated with them. It's typically the leaves that fall out of them, the bark that falls out of them, the accumulation of dead material on the forest floor below the trees that's the biggest hazard. I remind people all the time, the cost of removing eucalyptus trees is tremendous. If you were to remove all of the eucalyptus trees in some of the big stands in Marin, you would still have a wildfire hazard the following year. The native vegetation that we would want to encourage to grow back is going to burn. So it doesn't necessarily mitigate your risk just removing those trees. And frankly, they're a little less of a hazard than I think we've come to assume.
All right, good to hear. Let me ask each panelist to tick off 2 or 3 ideas in response to this general question: what more needs to be done to assure that planning is broad enough to encompass the different perspectives represented on the panel here today. So if you had 2 or 3 top-line recommendations, what would they be? And Joel, you're right next to me, so you're going to start.
Okay, well, insurance-wise, of course, it's really pushing back any fuels away from the home is kind of the principal thing that an insurer would look at as they're looking at your individual property. So, you have all kinds of things that might occur a little further away from the property that still could be problematic, but they're really looking, if they get down to that close of underwriting, to anything hanging over your roof line or that collects in your rain gutters, because they'd have to inspect every year to see if that's still an issue, right? They go out, you've cleaned your gutters. 6 months later, they could be full of debris again if there are trees hanging over your gutters. Insurers don't want to inspect your property. They want to look at something and know that's likely to stay the same and I don't have to spend the money to go look again. So take care of everything that affects your immediate house. I'll just stick with one.
I just want everyone to make sure they're registered with Alert Marin so that they get emergency notifications. You should have a plan on evacuation. There's checklists on the FIREsafe Marin website. Those are the 2 things. Have a plan and get registered for Alert Marin to receive emergency notifications.
I think the carbon benefits of reducing catastrophic fires that Leroy mentioned notwithstanding, I think the thing that I think we need to focus on in Marin is defining the problem. The problem is that our homes are burning and our families' lives are at risk during these major wildfires, and we can do things about that. I think the most significant thing that we haven't talked about at all tonight really is what we can do to harden our homes. If we can get to a point, it's going to take a long time. We know how to build homes that won't ignite during wildfires. If we can get to a point where the majority of our housing stock is resistant to ignition from wildfires, we've eliminated a big part of the problem. We've eliminated a lot of the carbon that's released during catastrophic urban conflagrations, and we've significantly reduced the risk to our lives.
And to me, it's really taking that multidisciplinary perspective. And our county fire, as you heard, works very closely with our parks and open space, and I think that kind of collaboration and the input from different perspectives is crucially important, because I agree with Carrie. Home hardening is important, but that's not the only thing we need to do. And sometimes I think people think of defensible space as going in and raising everything around the house and then they feel safer. That's not the way to make sure that you have a resilient, sustainable, carbon sequestering yard and that our environment is being treated the way it needs to be. And so I think it's getting that information from all of our good folks who are looking at these issues in a variety of ways. And then if you are taking steps to do the home hardening, you look at that as an opportunity to do something else that is going to increase the energy efficiency of your home and have an impact on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. This is like a wealth of opportunities we have, and I think that we make ourselves less safe if we only focus on fire, and we make ourselves more resilient if we take the broader look and think of everything we're doing from a multitude of perspectives. Then we've enhanced ourselves in a very rich way.
So it's natural for people to take the recent experience and extrapolate from that and think that is sort of the basis of what they can expect to happen. And it's important to always keep in mind now that climate change is not like this one-off thing that happened and now we're done. It's an accelerating process. So no one alive today on the planet will ever experience a stable climate system again. And so we have to use the best science that we can to anticipate things that are very different from what we've experienced in the past. We can't limit our planning about the future to even just this recent past. So it really worries me when I see people saying this is the new normal, because there is no such thing as a new normal anymore. It's always going to be changing.
That's a good point, and I'd just like to reference a book that I recently found, and I interviewed the author. The book is called 2100, A Dystopian Utopia, and the book is written by architects, and they have planned out adaptation for humans to survive on a planet that has warmed by 4 degrees by the year 2100. Now, when they started 3 years ago, that was an acceptable projection, and we do believe that things are accelerating even faster than that. But it is a fascinating actual blueprint for human survival. And I'll just thumbnail it that the 2 most livable cities in 2100 will be Vancouver and Moscow. And there will be a Club Med at the South Pole. That gives you a sense. We will be either inundated or suffer from desertification in this part of the world. So it offers some hope for people who are looking for that, but also some pretty graphic and solid ideas about the level of change required for human life to survive. And Dr. Santora, your comment?
Learn Russian. No, just kidding. Get educated, honestly. The first step, visit readymarin.org. If you complete that step and complete all the actions there, go to a medical reserve corps, first aid for disaster response, and go to CERT. After getting educated, if you can, volunteer. Join one of your neighborhood response groups, join CERT, join the Medical Reserve Corps. And I'm really proud our Marin Interagency Disaster Coalition is coming together. So either if you're a faith-based organization or a social organization you're involved in, ask if they're engaged with the Marin, our volunteer organization assisting in disasters. We call it Marin Interagency Disaster Coalition. See if your organization is engaged and see if your organization is ready.
All right, thank you. I have one more question that I'd like each panelist to address, and if you could keep it to a minute or two in the interest of time, I'd appreciate that. And it's a broad question. What resources do we need to find and deploy to adequately deal with these issues, and where do we get the money to pay for it? Who'd like to take that one first?
Can I start? Marin County has the resources. If you listen to all the sponsoring groups that were here, that were sponsoring this, we have tremendous assets in this community and tremendous strengths. I think what we need to shift towards is collective action, where we're working together and communicating across our silos and across our agencies, because I believe we can work together. We can develop a strategic plan. We have great plans that are already outlining what we need to do. We just need to follow some of them and get to our goals.
All right. Professor?
So I'm in the analysis and modeling business, and so I always think through that frame. And we keep getting resources. So just like she said, the resources exist. We keep getting more resources to model things more precisely, right? Finer spatial resolutions. And if that was enough, we would already have done a lot by this point. Right. I think we need to shift our focus a lot more, not just to solutions, but to better communication, like tools that help people learn, gain an intuition about the relationships between these different complex systems that we're trying to manage, and move away from just ever greater sort of false precision about the outcomes.
Supervisor?
I'm with them. I think those were really excellent responses, both of them, and I think the collective action piece is key. And making sure that we're actually asking the right questions. We do get a lot of resources, but making sure that we're thinking about how do we live in our new world. That really struck me with the terrible air days we had, and I thought, this is not just a passing moment. It's not just an incident, it's our life in the future. And so I think the innovation, the creativity, really the communicating, the sharing ideas, and becoming more resilient and self-reliant in ourselves and getting away from the service economy mentality that we have. There was someone who was talking to me about one of our floating homes communities in Sausalito about a month ago, and he was commenting on how when the floating homes communities first started, it was a collection of mariners who worked very closely together. There was a lot of mutual aid. People would go out at 3 in the morning to help their neighbor if something came up. Now you have people who are buying $1 million houseboats, and he got asked a question by one of them, what is that? And he said, well, that's the line that ties your boat to what keeps it in place. And he thought, this is not a good sign for mutual aid and having those resilient skills. And, you know, I think back to my mother who could fix everything. She was a farm girl. She was always fixing the toaster. And I don't have those skills, and so I've been challenging myself to develop those kinds of skills and have a very different kind of mentality about how we live in the world.
Just watch one YouTube video a day.
I need to watch more videos, clearly. Yeah.
Todd, Lando?
I think about all the varied problems that my children and grandchildren are going to have to face to adapt to climate change, and you know, some of them I have no idea how they're going to overcome them. Since we're talking about wildfires, the issues that are presented with wildfires are actually some of the easiest to overcome. Again, we can build houses that won't ignite from wildfires. We can maintain the vegetation. Everything you need to do that is on the shelf at Home Depot right now, or better at Jackson's or Goodman's or Rafael Lumber, the local hardware stores. but they're right there. We know how to do it. It's simple. We need to take action and do it. And it's up to the individuals to do that. This is really one of the easier problems to tackle overall. Now, how climates affect wildfires, what it does in the Sierras, there are tremendous impacts there that are much more difficult to overcome. But what we're all concerned about is what's going to happen at our own address in our own neighborhood.
Yeah. Christie, Neill?
So as the fire agencies and all the chiefs, their number one concern is still response and evacuation of the public and their safety. And so probably one thing that we could use a lot more work on, I think, is evacuation and traffic planning in the county. Our infrastructure is old and it's not fit for the people and the equipment that we have today. So more work in that area.
All right, thank you. And finally, Joel Laucher.
Yeah, I would say the main thing is to start now. So whatever it is that you're able to start doing or changing, do those first things that come easily, but start them now. I had mentioned looking at your homeowner's insurance limits. Don't put that off until you have a loss, and don't actually make claims unless you really, really need to use your coverage, because claims are an issue. But all those little things in life that you can do, like maybe you don't really need that item, so don't buy it. Maybe you don't need to make that trip to the store. You can combine it with 3 other trips and just do it tomorrow. There are many, many little incremental steps that you can initiate starting tonight, right, or starting tomorrow. So just start doing those now rather than going home and pondering it for a while. Start with some small steps.
Well, I want to thank our panelists. I certainly learned a lot. Each of you brought powerful information and perspectives to these issues. So thank you very much for joining us. I want to thank the organizers and the sponsors of this event, and say hello to the folks on Marin TV. Good night, everyone.